So, let's start at the very beginning. Narcissism. Where does the idea even come from? Well, it all traces back to ancient Greek mythology and this man named Narcissus. Let me paint the picture for you. Narcissus was this extraordinarily handsome young man, right? People adored him, but he, well, just didn't seem to care for anyone's affection.
And it wasn't out of shyness or humility. No, it was because he fell completely in love with his own reflection.
Exactly. He would gaze into a pool of water, utterly captivated by his own image. He couldn't pull himself away. And in the myth, this obsession ultimately led to his death. It's a tragic story, but it's kind of poetic, don't you think?
It is, and that story gives us the origin of the term narcissism. But here's the thing. Over time, we've turned Narcissus's tale into a psychological concept. In modern terms, narcissism describes a self-centered personality style where someone is excessively preoccupied with themselves, how they look, what people think about them, and that happens often at the expense of others.
Now here's where it gets interesting. Not all narcissism is bad. Psychologists actually place it on a spectrum. On one end, you've got normal, healthy self-esteem. A little bit of narcissism, wanting to feel good about yourself, is completely natural.
Right. That's where self-confidence and ambition come from. It's part of what drives us to succeed, isn't it? But when narcissism starts tipping towards excess, it can become destructive.
Exactly. Take something like narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. This is where self-involvement isn't just excessive, it's pathological. People with NPD might show extreme arrogance, a lack of empathy, and this overwhelming need to feel important or superior to others. It's a huge shift from healthy self-esteem.
And it's not just about how they see themselves, but how they interact with others too, isn't it? Narcissistic behaviour can harm relationships, cause workplace issues. It spreads outward in all kinds of negative ways.
Exactly. A great way to see the difference is to compare moderate narcissism, like someone who's just confident, maybe even a bit flamboyant, to pathological narcissism. For instance, think about those corporate leaders who can't seem to work with anyone unless it's all about them. That's leaning towards the toxic side of the spectrum.
Oh, absolutely. And it's worth noting some of the traits we see at play here. Grandiosity, entitlement, manipulative behaviours, and an overall lack of empathy. Once you add those together, you're looking at something far more complex than just confidence.
And that's exactly why we need to be clear about our definitions. Not everyone who loves taking a selfie or has a bit of swagger is a narcissist. But when someone's obsession with themselves begins harming others, well, that's where the warning bells start ringing.
Speaking of how an obsession with oneself might manifest, let's talk about social media. It's hard to imagine life without it now, isn't it? Platforms like Instagram and TikTok have completely changed how we connect, communicate, and even, well, perceive ourselves.
They really have. And what's fascinating is how these platforms seem to encourage self-promotion like never before. I mean, we're talking about carefully curated profiles, endless selfies, and updates designed to grab as much attention as possible.
Exactly. It's like they've built a system that rewards this behaviour. Likes, followers, the little dopamine hits from every notification. It's no wonder so many people get drawn into it. The platforms practically thrive on people showcasing their best, most polished versions of themselves.
And that polished version usually comes with one goal in mind: validation. The problem is, this constant striving for approval, for likes and comments, doesn't always translate well to the real world.
Right. Take influencer culture, for example. Influencers, by design, live on that edge of self-promotion. Their careers often depend on projecting this perfect image, whether it's about their lifestyle, fashion, or fitness. But what happens when the line between authentic and curated blurs?
Well, that's where it gets messy. For one, it can have serious implications on mental health. People who follow these influencers tend to compare their own lives to these curated, often unrealistic standards. And the influencers themselves? Many of them face their own struggles, particularly when their online image doesn't match their actual experiences.
Exactly. There's this constant pressure for everyone involved to maintain an idealised persona, even if it's far from reality. And that pressure can really strain relationships too, whether it's with friends or romantic partners.
Absolutely. And let's not forget, this isn't just about individuals. It's become a societal phenomenon. Social media has created this feedback loop where self-promotion is not only normalised, but celebrated. The more extreme the persona, the more attention they command.
Totally. I mean, we could talk about so many examples, but let's take one prominent influencer we've both looked into, someone who embodies everything we've just mentioned. Think about the lavish lifestyle post, the constant reminders of success, the perfect images crafted for maximum engagement.
Right. And those same traits, grandiosity, entitlement, fit so neatly with what we describe as narcissistic. It's a perfect case study of how these platforms don't just reflect individual behaviour, but amplify it on a global scale.
And in a way, it's not even entirely their fault. The platforms are practically designed to reward that kind of attention-seeking behaviour. It's a cycle that keeps feeding itself.
It really is. And the impact stretches far beyond just the influencer themselves. It's shaping how millions of people engage with social media and their own self-images.
Thinking about how social media amplifies these traits, it makes you wonder, where does narcissism really come from? Is it something people are born with, or is it shaped by the world around us?
Well, here's the thing. It's a bit of both. Studies show that narcissistic traits have a genetic foundation. For example, twin studies suggest that certain tendencies, like grandiosity or entitlement, are often inherited.
Right, but it's not all about genetics, is it? Environmental factors play a huge role too. Things like how you're raised, whether you are overly praised or even constantly criticised, can amplify or diminish these traits.
Exactly. Parenting, styles, social influences, even culture contribute to shaping someone's narcissism. And it's fascinating to think about how two people can start with a similar genetic foundation, but end up so different based on their environment.
Totally. And speaking of differences, there's also the distinction between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism, isn't there? They might share some core traits, but they're worlds apart in how they show up.
Completely. Grandiose narcissists, for example, exude confidence, dominance, and charm. They can be bold risk-takers who thrive in social situations, and on the surface, they might seem like incredibly successful leaders.
Whereas vulnerable narcissism looks almost opposite. Instead of confidence, there's insecurity, low self-esteem, and a need for constant reassurance. They tend to shy away from social settings and might even respond with anger if they feel rejected or unseen.
It's like two sides of the same coin. Both stem from the same core, self-centeredness and entitlement, but their behaviours couldn't be more different. And this is where the debates among psychologists get really interesting.
Oh, definitely. One of the ongoing debates is about how we even define these traits properly. Should they be considered personality dimensions, disorders, or something else entirely?
And then there's the challenge of measuring it, right? How do you assess something as complex and nuanced as narcissism in a way that captures all the subtleties?
Exactly. These debates highlight just how rich and layered human personality really is. It's not about stamping someone as good or bad, but understanding the why behind their behaviours.
And perhaps encouraging a little empathy, even for narcissists. Understanding how their genetics, upbringing, and environment all collided to shape who they are.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've covered plenty today. From its mythical origins to its expressions in modern society, narcissism isn't just some buzzword. It's a window into how we see ourselves and interact with the world.
Absolutely. And understanding it better, that's a step toward healthier relationships, better communication, and maybe even a little more self-awareness for all of us.
Couldn't agree more. And that's all for today. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.